Hello, and welcome to the very first episode of the Campus Technology Insider podcast. I'm Rhea Kelly, Executive Editor for Campus Technology, and your host. Higher education is going through unprecedented times, and institutions' response to the COVID-19 pandemic has by necessity been a constantly evolving process. I think it's safe to say that at this point, most institutions are grappling with their plans for the fall semester. What will a return to campus look like? Will teaching and learning need to remain online? What's the best way to keep the campus community safe? To help answer these questions, I wanted to talk with a futurist, someone who pays close attention to present-day trends in order to forecast possible scenarios for the future. My guest, Bryan Alexander, is a futurist, researcher, writer, consultant, and educator who works in the field of how technology transforms education. Bryan has been covering COVID-19 and its impact on academia, both on his blog and through his Future Trends Forum, a weekly series of open, interactive video conversations about the future of higher education. He's a prolific speaker. You may have seen him at the EDUCAUSE annual conference for many years. And he's also a senior scholar at Georgetown University and teaches graduate seminars in its Learning, Design, and Technology program. By the way, if you're wondering about Bryan's forecasting methods, he wrote a wonderful article for Campus Technology a couple years ago called How to Be an EdTech Futurist. In it, he details how he identifies and analyzes trends, creates future scenarios, and even the importance of science fiction in envisioning and shaping the future. You can find that story on campustechnology.com. And you can find more information about all of Bryan's work at bryanalexander.com. That's Bryan with a Y. Now let's jump right into the interview. And to give some context, it was recorded the first week of June, just as states began to loosen COVID-19 restrictions, and shortly after protests erupted across the country in response to the death of George Floyd. Needless to say, there was a lot of uncertainty and unrest going on. Bryan and I talked about higher education's response to the COVID-19 pandemic and how the fall semester might play out as colleges and universities reopen. Here's our chat. Hi, Bryan, and welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you, Rhea, for the invitation. It's great to be here.
So, as a futurist, you've been closely following higher education's response to COVID-19 and exploring how the pandemic might play out in the future. I'm thinking in particular, I've seen on your blog, you've written about 3 scenarios about what the fall 2020 semester will look like. So I was wondering if you could describe those for us and give us a little breakdown.
Sure. I came up with these in March, and I was trying to figure out where higher education might be headed. And to create them, I went back to the pandemic itself to try to figure out, all right, where is the disease headed? Where is the virus going to go? How big will it be? And what kind of size will it have? And I looked into the research and found there were basically 3 different options. One was the pandemic would burn out and die down, fairly quickly. Something like what we've seen in Wuhan or in some other cities. The second was that the pandemic would just keep going. Something like AIDS, it would just keep persisting. That we wouldn't have vaccine, we wouldn't have treatment, and our best measures to defeat it wouldn't be completely successful, and so it would just keep roaring along. And the third was the idea that we would have a wavy pandemic. It would come and go depending on where you are geographically. And so, given those 3, I built 3 scenarios for higher ed. So, one of them is the idea that we could have a fall semester where we're back on campus in some way. And I call that the post pandemic campus. So, campus leaders decide that it is safe enough to reopen face to face instruction and residential life and campus life and services and all of that. The second I called COVID fall. That's when a campus is basically online for the fall semester and probably the spring, because they've deemed that on the one hand it is too dangerous, that the possibilities of infection bodily damage and death are too great. And then second, that they had sufficient capacity to offer a decent quality online education, so they would do that. And the third option, called toggle term. And in this scenario, campuses switch back and forth between the previous two depending on conditions. So, for example, they may open in September and have a really good time with face to face instruction with some kind of quarantining, some kind of social distancing, plexiglass, and so forth. But then in November, the pandemic comes roaring back at far greater incidence. And so they decide, okay, we're going to send everybody home and then switch over to the COVID fall semester. And then come February, it's burned out again, and they decide to open and welcome everyone back. So so far, I mean, when I published this in March, I've been tracking it. The post-pandemic campus one seems to be the most popular. The Chronicle of Higher Ed has been tracking a few hundred schools, and they find something like 65% are claiming now that they'll be open in the fall. So that seems to be the most popular. There's a bunch that have been saying, no, 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 we're going to be online, going for the COVID fall model. And in that scenario, California State University system is the biggest example. The toggle term, nobody wants to say it out loud, I think. It's very risky thing to say. It doesn't give you the assurance of face to face, and it bodes for more administrative overhead and more planning and more cost. But I have seen some evidence for it. Educause did a survey of campus IT departments, and the majority of them were planning for all kinds of heavy IT in the fall. That sounded like maybe high flex, maybe online, but definitely being ready for all options. So all three of those seem to be in play right now.
It does seem like no matter what they say about whether they're opening up the, on-campus instruction or not, they're still having to prepare for that toggle term.
Indeed. I mean, there was a testimony in front of Congress yesterday where one of the experts said anybody who plans to open a campus for face to face instruction or face to face presence at all this fall should assume COVID infections happening. So, all right, let's say you go with the Purdue model that Mitch Daniels has been describing, where they think, okay, we can handle this, and we think we've got enough countermeasures in place. On the same Senate hearing, Daniels said that they have ordered at least a mile of plexiglass so far. They do social distancing, they
Wow.
set up alternative campuses, they do all of that. But at some point, they get an infection, and we know from the social network analysis of students that infections spread among them very, very rapidly. And at some point, they may have to decide, okay, we can't do this. It is simply far too dangerous. Now, what's interesting is that a lot of the pro open proponents describe the possible damages as first order. That is, they're talking about, all right, what happens to a student on campus getting ill? They don't as often talk about faculty or staff, who are in many ways more vulnerable. But what almost no one talks about is the second order. So, we have 18, 19, 20-year-olds on campus. They get the infection. Let's just say they all survive. I mean, statistically, some of them are going to get some form of hospitalization. But let's just say they all survive. Well, at some point, they're going to go back out into the community. They're going to go shopping for food at a local restaurant. They're going to go home and visit their parents. They're going to go home on the holidays and see grandparents. So, the second order infections, that's when things become really, really dicey. I mean, we don't, I mean, I've heard different numbers for the R naught for this. Let's just say it's three, and each of them affect three people, then it spreads. And then those people are going to be likely to include folks who have comorbidities or who have advanced age. So, I mean, I think that's the real danger. And that's one of the reasons why I think so many colleges and universities now are pressing to have immunity from lawsuits because there's going to be a family who loses a grandfather. And I'm picking grandfather because so far the death toll rate tends to be about two-thirds male, and they'll sue the campus. I mean, it's just logical, especially in America, where we're pretty happy to sue people, and campuses are juicy targets, especially the elite ones. So a lot of campuses now are pushing for some kind of immunity from lawsuits, from prosecution.
That's interesting. Um, I know I've seen when campuses are announcing their plans for fall, they have a wide variety of strategies for ensuring, the social distancing in classrooms and dorms and things like that. Have you seen any plans that strike you as a particularly good idea? One that comes to mind for me is Prescott College in Arizona recently announced that they're using a block class schedule in which students take one course at a time in accelerated 4-week sessions. So instead of moving from course to course with different classmates each day, they study with one small group of peers. So that way they're kind of minimizing the number of contacts among faculty and students and staff. Um, have you heard any other interesting plans?
Yeah, Beloit College just did that. They switched from a semester to what they call a mod or a module session, which I think is 8 weeks. I believe they were hoping for 6 or 5 at first, and that has a lot of advantages. It may reduce the circulation of populations, and the other thing is it also if you think about say an undergraduate career which has say let's just say 8 to 10 semesters. Well, if you break that up into 20 or 50, one semester being stressful or bad is less bad than having a whole semester, which is like an eighth or a tenth of your experience. I've seen a few others. There's the scheduling shift to end face-to-face instruction with Thanksgiving, and it's usually phrased as "we will resume uh, remote instruction after that." And by remote instruction, they mean study for exams and then hold exams, basically. And that's interesting because that for schools that are in the North Country, the Midwest and the Northeast, that means they get to reduce payments for heat for winter. But also, it's a bet that COVID-19 may come roaring back with the winter. And the science on this is still speculative. No one's quite sure of the impact of summer heat or winter cold. But I think that's part of the bet that by late November they want to be out of it, reducing the face-to-face instruction. So that's one. I think the other is just seeing the high flex method really suddenly go into the mainstream. That was just one of many different schools of thought for how to teach with technology. But now it's got its moment in the spotlight, and so I'm seeing a lot of campuses either deliberately doing a high flex planning or using the term, or they're doing other things that amount to the same thing.
Hmm. And also, I think shifting to remote over the winter takes care of the problem of students going on a vacation and then coming back to campus, having
Right?
been in contact with
Yes.
people from a different state or whatever.
Yeah, it reduces the number of contacts that way. I mean, and it I'm not sure how much it'll amount to because kind of Thanksgiving and winter holiday, kind of similar population in some ways, but it could reduce some vectors, and so that's always worth doing in a pandemic.
So the HighFlex model. Now, am I correct in my understanding that that is basically synchronous uh,
Hmm.
blended learning, where some students are in class and some are sort of video conferencing in or joining from some way remotely?
Yeah, that's exactly it, Ray. You nailed it very elegantly. Gosh, I have nothing to say now. That's very good.
Oh, now I feel smart.
Well, you are, and you did nail it. So the idea is you have exactly that. You have a physical classroom, which is intertwined with remote presence, and so it may mean some number of students are remote. The instructor and/or support staff may be remote. And so you have this combination of folks sitting in a table or a hall, and then you have many screens and other devices sharing people. So I mean, to do this is it takes some doing. It doesn't work out of the box. You've got to be able to have uh, in the face-to-face environment, you have to have sufficient hardware, meaning you need to have projections or screens so that everybody in the face-to-face classroom can see everybody who's remote, and you take care of sound, which is in some ways harder because that involves miking. And miking a room, there are a lot of ways of doing it badly. So, do you use an intelligent mic like the Owl? Do you use ceiling mounted mics, or do you give each person a mic? And then you have all the problems that you have with AV in person, talking over each other, echo, feedback, that kind of thing. And then the remote people all need to have sufficient hardware, which again is not necessarily a given. There was a story in Counterpunch
Right.
a couple of weeks ago about a prof who had terrible hardware and had to basically rebuy everything.
Wow. I imagine that it would be a challenge to teach that way too, and so there's probably some instructional design that would need to happen.
There is. There's instructional design, a change in mentality for the instructor, but also a change in mentality for the students. So, I mean, I've done this for a few semesters, and I find it right now. I find it very comfortable. But basically, the instructor has to kind of go overboard in paying attention to the remote students. They have to make them present to the face-to-face students. So it's like many instructors have gone through this in different ways where you teach yourself to call on populations you normally don't call on. So maybe like Kevin Gannon's progressive stack, where you try to deliberately call on underrepresented minorities. Gender dynamics in the classroom, where if you're in a classroom where men tend to speak more than women, you try to call on women more than men, and so on. So it's similar to that, and that you really try to make those remote learners present. And then you also want to, and that takes everything from calling on them, asking questions, and then using the technology in different ways. It may be having them speak out loud in a video, it may be using a text chat, maybe using some other tool that you've got that's going. Um, then the change in mindset for the students is pretty similar. If they're remote, they have to, in many ways, kind of make themselves more present. It's like speaking up more. They have to, advocate for themselves. They have to, depending on the technology, raise their digital hands, talk more, use the chat box, and so on. But the non-remote students also have to pay more attention to those remote students as they form a learning community, so that they really have that kind of conversation happening, and that takes a change in habit. But like I said, it's one that you can make, and it's one that's rewarding because it yields a richer, better classroom experience. And once you've done it, I think it's very, very congenial. It reminds me of using bifocals. You just you move your eye muscles a little bit, toggling up and down in the same pair of lenses. It's the same thing. I find myself just used to checking, okay, eyeballs around the table, then look at the screen, back and forth.
Wow, that's really interesting comparison. Well, speaking of students, with all the plans that institutions are making for the fall, um, I mean, none of them can really know what students are actually going to do. Are they going to come back? Might they be reluctant to return? What do
Absolutely,
you think?
absolutely. I mean, it really depends on the institution, but we're going to have some kind of enrollment drop because of this. I mean, think first of all, how many students will fear infection, and either they'll fear it themselves, they'll be afraid of getting sick, or they'll, their family, if they're traditional age students, maybe their families will be afraid for them. Don't get sick and come back home and infect grandpa. Um, but another reason is that they may like the online learning. They may just find that to be congenial. They feel that they can live at home and they can have all this experience and they're comfortable with it. For different types. I mean, there was a fun piece in, I think it was the New York Times a few weeks ago by a middle schooler or a high school student who was saying, I love this. This is a much better experience. She was saying that she didn't get interrupted as much and distracted by students acting out in class. So, I mean, that's another possibility. But on top of that, there's also the fear that the students may get infected. They may spread that. But they may also just feel that the experience won't be quite as good. I want to go, but I can't go to parties. Wow. Or I can go, but I can't go to sports events. I mean, it depends on the student. But they, may feel it's just a substandard experience, so they may as well stay home. And it's not just students, though. Rhea. I mean, in some ways, the more dire part is faculty and staff who don't want to be on campus. I mean, students tend to be younger, depending again on the institution. But what do you do with faculty and staff in their 60s and 70s who may have comorbidities? They've got emphysema, they've got COPD, they've got hypertension, they've got diabetes. Do they really want to be on the campus surrounded with students who are busily circulating infections among each other? Um, and then that leads to some interesting policy and micro political decisions. Can a faculty member say, no, I'm not coming to campus, I'm going to work remotely? And what are their rights? Can they be compelled? Can they be sanctioned by doing that? Does it matter if they have tenure or not? Well, the same with staff. I mean, does it? Can a dean say, no, I'm going to work from home? How about a grants officer or a librarian? IT staff. So I think in many ways it's going to be a high flex fall. It's going to be that kind of blended hybrid fall. The question is really how we structure it.
Interesting. Yeah, that's something I hadn't actually thought about. And especially, faculty are in a class with, possibly hundreds of students
Hmm.
and having multiple of those per day or per week. And
Hmm.
whereas students are, potentially in only coming into contact with fewer people, the risk is weighed weighs more heavily on the faculty side, I think.
Good point. Good point. And then you think too about faculty who love their students, who want to get close to them, right? Who want to shake hands, who want to hear from them. The faculty who are really attuned to student expression, listening to voice, watching body language and face and so on. That's does good teaching become risky? I mean, or do we teach from literally behind plexiglass shields? And what happens if, I mean, you and I right now are talking without masks, but if we have to wear masks, that muffles things. If you're talking, I can't see most of your face when you talk, so I'm losing some of that, the value of that face-to-face experience. If all the students have masks, faculty are going to miss frowns, smiles, quizzical expressions. And what happens to people who just, their voices are muffled when they talk through a mask? There's all kinds of difficult ways for this. I think in many ways the most humane solution, not for everything, not for everybody, but would be to be online. But I think most campuses are afraid of the reputational and financial hit that would represent.
Yeah. So I'm wondering about the student experience, and what their expectations are for what their fall semester is going to be like. And
Mhm.
based on your own experience teaching at Georgetown, what do you think that students want, or what are they expecting, and what should institutions be prioritizing in planning for what that experience is going to be like?
I think one thing that campuses are going to have to struggle to prioritize is out of classroom support, because we have, all the surveys show that larger and larger numbers of students, even before the pandemic started, were reporting mental health issues. And of course, the pandemic is just going to ramp that up even further. Plus, we have this week's unrest following the police shooting, or police killing. So, you know, there's going to be increasing demand for mental health. So campuses should spend more, creating more hours, more positions, more contact points for students to get mental health services. That's going to be hard when they're financially pressured like that. Similarly, and we think about students who are going to be suffering from all kinds of challenges to learning. So, what happens if they have a family member at home who is hospitalized because of COVID 19? What happens if they have lost their job or their family have lost jobs? What happens if their town has just had an economic collapse? So all of these stresses really, you know, ye- they should drive a college or university to support students better. And partly that's in the classroom, where the faculty members have to be more attentive to the student experience and to what students want, as you say, right? And part of it is outside of the classroom. So there's mental health, but also think about teaching and learning centers, writing centers, quantitative literacy centers. I mean, all kinds of paracurricular locations and sites that can help students succeed academically. Uh, think about the library, the huge role the library can play in student lives. All of that is something which needs to be supported. I think students are, in a sense, as a whole, going to be ambivalent. On the one hand, they want their experience, they want the college environment, whatever the college is. If they're going to community college, they want that one that's local, that's responsive to their needs. If they're going to a liberal arts college, they want that kind of attentiveness. If they're going to a religious college, some possible form of faith expression, and so on. They're going to want to maximize that, so they're going to want the beautiful campus, the accessible campus, the research opportunities, and all of that. On the flip side, students know they're in a pandemic. They know they're in a crisis mode, so they're going to want safety. And they may also want to fight for justice. They may want this to be equitable. So they may be really concerned with the working conditions of staff. They may be concerned with the working conditions of faculty. They may be interested in the local community. So this can play out in terms of town-gown relations. If you go to, say, Vassar College, will the students be interested in the progress of the pandemic through Poughkeepsie? Middlebury College in Vermont. Will the students want to check on what happens in the town of Middlebury and so on? Take NYU or Columbia and their connections to that city, which has just gone through, the most horrific phase of the pandemic so far. Although thankfully, apparently today they haven't had any new cases for a couple of days. How do you support all of that if you're an administrator? How do you arrange for these kind of things to happen? Does it go through residence life for those that are residential, or some other form of student life? Do you support organizations or clubs? Do you support outreach centers? And then when do you have the opposite? When you're afraid that this could be all consuming and students can lose track of their studies and either drop out, do a bad job, or have to defer learning. So I think there's a wide range of support that they're going to have to balance out to make sure students get the safest, and also the best possible outcome.
Yeah, it seems like, student advising, well, it's always been important, but even now, even more so.
Yeah,
And I wonder, there's all sorts of technologies out there for tracking student progress and trying to predict, when they're at risk of having issues. I wonder if schools will be investing more in those.
they should. But then this leads to a whole other issue, which is, I mean, if we're going to do this right, if we're going to take a campus and reopen it to in-person experience, we're going to have to impose a level of surveillance and control that we're not accustomed to, and that many may resent or critique. So you think about, say, random testing. From a certain point of view, that's awkward. I mean, especially I haven't been tested yet. I've just seen enough of the diagrams to know that sticking that probe way up the nose is pretty awkward. But also, how often does that get done? How often do people go through contact tracing? Again, that's a level of surveillance over one's life, which makes absolute sense. It's essential from a public health perspective. But if you're trying to, create a student climate of autonomy, of freedom, and of privacy, that's a little tricky. And especially since for the past 4 years or so, we've had this huge techlash. We've had all the criticisms of Google, of Facebook, and so on for violating privacy. It's going to be kind of tricky for a campus that's concerned about that to, at the same time, really compromise students' privacy. And again, not just students, but also faculty and staff. I mean, they're going to have to impose a regime that is something like a medical emergency or medical encampment. Think, for example, about how many campuses that might consider forming a perimeter to protect the campus grounds from passersby, or will they create a check station? A stop where people have to go and get their temperature tested, say through a forehead scanner. It's not that reliable, but it might be good. It might be seen as a due diligence on the part of a university. Uh, I mean, this is a situation which some are going to be uncomfortable with, and we've already seen flashes of that discomfort. You can think of the protests in Michigan and Ohio, for example, where protesters charged the state governments with being too draconian in their imposition of quarantine measures. But also, you could think about the huge rush into public life, both over the 2 weeks ago, where people went to the Ozarks and to the Gulf of Mexico to play in beaches, but also the past few days when people have been protesting in ways that are just, they seem guaranteed to cause another wavelet of infection. So we know that students, just by their actions, may not be happy with this, and it's going to take a lot of enforcement, which means conscripting faculty and staff. The librarians are going to have to, watch users, patrons, students quite carefully as they go through the library building, making sure they don't get within 6 feet of each other. I mean, how many faculty are ready to tell all students, make sure you've got your masks on, or don't go around this plexiglass shield, and so on. I mean, It's not quite wartime, but it's definitely like being in a hospital or being in an intensive care ward. And that's a shock that I don't think we're fully ready for, and I think a lot of students are going to be very uncomfortable with.
Yeah, it's a tough line to walk and so contrary to sort of the spirit of openness that is so central to higher education.
Yes, well said. Well said. I mean, it's going to make us in many ways close up. I mean, what do you, if you're a student right now and one of your professors decides to stay off campus, do you feel less connected to them? Do you feel that you have less access to them? If you're a student, are you going to be willing to ask all kinds of questions in a classroom, thinking that maybe one of the questions will show that you've done something to violate quarantine? No, it's a good point. We may become more inward looking. We may, in like a card game, we may not put our cards on the table, but instead hide them from other players.
Well, I hope that it can be more optimistic. I mean, I hope we can get back to normal, of course, and maybe these things will just sort of resolve themselves somehow.
Well, that's my post-pandemic scenario. You know that the infection rates drop to a level that we deem acceptable. I mean, we accept a certain casualty toll in all parts of our lives. The death toll on our roads. We kill what, about 35,000 people a year. Um, we accept the flu toll, which can be pretty high at times. Um, but we don't have a vaccine for COVID 19. In fact, we've never created a vaccine for coronavirus, so it may take years for this. And we don't have treatment. I mean, we treat it almost like hospice care, where we try and make people comfortable until they get better or die. It's very, very scary to think of. And I think it's possible that, as Mitch Daniels said, we'll just accept it as one of the stresses of life. We don't live in a life of safety. We live in a life subjected to all kinds of harms. So perhaps we become accustomed to this. And once the infection rate drops to a certain level, once the number of uh, people who are badly injured and the people who die drops to a certain level, I think people will become accustomed to it and they'll be happy to go to the bar and sit within 3 feet of people, thinking, all right, if it's not this, it may as well be the cold, it may be the flu. Um, that's that may be one way forward. The other way is, have you ever seen the movie Contagion?
No.
Oh, I strongly recommend it. It's on its face, it's a really, really good film. But also it has a lot of fun things in it and some really scary things. The scary thing is that it's from 2012 and it's a science fiction movie about a pandemic that hits the Earth and how we respond. So watching it now is very uncomfortable because it's so good. I mean, it's so spot on about things. Um,
Wow.
but it's also weird because of things that the CDC is the hero and they're all very competent. So that's too bad. My favorite part though is that Gwyneth Paltrow is in it, and she's patient zero, and she gets sick and dies right away, which isn't the fun part. The fun part is they autopsy her, and there's this great bit where they cut open her head and look at the brain, and the two doctors look at it. We can't see it. We just see the doctor's reactions, and one doctor looks at the other. Oh my god, we've got to tell someone. Yeah, tell everyone. It's an emergency. It's like the ultimate moment of celebrity culture, maybe, or the ultimate criticism of Goop. But one of the things about it that's so fascinating is a huge plot point is the development of the vaccine. And when the vaccine gets released, the problem is it can't be produced in sufficient quantities. So they actually come up with a lottery for giving the vaccine out. And then all kinds of politics go around that, with people accused of jumping the line and so on. That's still ahead if we get a vaccine. And this is where higher education plays a role again, because not all, but some colleges and universities are playing a role in healthcare. They're developing vaccines, they're doing research. And of course, one of the roles of everyone teaching in allied health, as well as librarians attached to them, is to help connect the population to those resources, so that we know what cure might be possible or what the research is and what the issues are. And so, that's one of many ways academia is connected to this. And who knows? It may be that a researcher from, UT Austin or the University of Michigan or Johns Hopkins is the one to publish a vaccine that can actually work. So, there are a lot of critical roles I think that higher education can play in this crisis.
Yeah. Well, the sort of positive thoughts of the potential of a vaccine, I think that's a good place to stop. Well, thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, it's actually my pleasure. I'm really glad to see you launching this new enterprise, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Rhea Kelly, and this was the Campus Technology Insider Podcast. Visit us online at campustechnology.com and let us know what you think of the podcast and what you'd like to hear on future episodes. Until next time.